Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. You're very, very welcome here to the Humanitarian Hub, where today's session is about towards the first annual high-level dialogue on loss and damage, perspectives from the humanitarian sector. And here on the panel, speaking today, we have a fantastic lineup of people who've got a huge range of experience from the humanitarian sector. So we hope this is going to be a really informative and interactive discussion together. I'm sure there's a lot of experience amongst all of you in the audience, so please get ready for the question and answer session later on also. I'm going to be introducing everyone as they start to speak, but before we get going, we're going to have an introductory keynote here from Madame Nimo Hassan, who is the director of the Somalia NGO Consortium. So please come on up, Nimo. Thank you.
Good morning. Assalamu alaikum. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to this COP29 Interagency Loss and Damage panel. This signals our renewed commitment to addressing the disparity between nations that have contributed most to the climate change and those who are suffering its consequences. It's important to look at how far we have come with this journey. And even when we're not there yet, we certainly can celebrate the small wins, one of it being the 100 million from the Climate Fund to Somalia. Last year, at this time like this, together, we launched the Declaration on Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace. I'm very delighted for those committed to this cause. At this point last year, I drew to your attention a story of Obah, a daughter of Jawhara from south-central Somalia. Jawhara lost her daughter, Obah, to the defects of climate change, hunger. Obah is still replaceable. Could we have changed this fate with timely funding and support to Obah's community? Maybe. Could we have been in that community before this disaster struck? Without women's voices, like that of Jawhara in climate funding, we risk building solutions that failed half the world, ignoring the unique strength and insights of women bring to resilience. Excluding them not only deepens existing inequalities, but also weakens our collective ability to adapt, leaving communities even more vulnerable to future climate shocks. At this time last year, the Loss and Damage Fund was operationalized, and we need to ask ourselves if this funding and a support has reached communities like Obah in Kismayo, where rising ocean temperatures and shifting currents are driving fish stocks away. I'm here to tell you that this August, IOM estimated that out of the more than 10,000 new displacements in Somalia, 60% were induced by climate shocks and the rest by conflict. Is there anything we could have learned from humanitarians to reach these communities? Could we have relied on their infrastructure to prevent further loss? But most importantly, could we have reached families like that of Obah much quicker if we supported her community directly? For communities and countries like Somalia with mixed fragility, both climate and conflict, their challenges are unique. Young women and girls shift from the scars of conflict to flooded homes or water-parched farmlands. These countries might not fit the parameters of most climate funds, yet they are the most vulnerable. They require unique consideration if financing for loss and damage is to be adequate, fair, and timely. Last COP, I closed the launch of the COP28 Relief, Recovery, Peace Declaration. So it's timely that I open this session to reiterate climate financing must be fair, adequate, timely, and accessible. Inclusive climate investments should prioritize countries with low adaptive capacity, and we must acknowledge that countries at this climate conflict nexus face unique challenges and require unique considerations. Lastly, high carbon emission countries must support low emission countries to future-proof their economies for climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, the key question before us is how can we channel climate financing effectively to reach those who need it most, rather than simply where it's the easiest to deploy? What insights can we gain from the work of humanitarians to ensure that every dollar truly makes a difference in communities on the front lines of climate change? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nima, if you'd like to join us again here. So this event is brought to you today by the Interagency Standing Committee, which is a group of different humanitarian actors from the UN system, from the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, and from the non-governmental or civil society partners. So it really is representing a huge spectrum of expertise, both policy and operational expertise. And as Nima, you were referring to there in your discussion, the real priority for the IASC, IASC, is really about how we can make sure that there are actionable solutions on the ground for people in really the most vulnerable situations, as you were just describing, Nimo. And as we're all looking forward, I expect many of you are aware of, or you're following the decision that there will now be the first high-level dialogue on the funding arrangements for responding to loss and damage in April this year. So we're hoping indeed that many of the parties, the boards, the advisory board of the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, the board of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, that they're all thinking about preparations and how they're going to make sure that this dialogue happening in April is going to be really focused on that complementarity and coherence between the huge range of action that's already happening out there, not least in the humanitarian sector, and how that can really inform and make sure that the fund is going to be really addressing gaps and addressing those gaps in a way that reaches the most vulnerable populations on the ground. So I'm going to start with a quick fire question to all of you here. It's a tough one for you to do because it's a complex answer, but top line, what for you all would be the priority needs and gaps in both funding and technical assistance in responding to loss and damage? So what are those key gaps for you? Who'd like to have a go first? I'll give you about a minute each only. So really your top lines, what are the key gaps?
Shall we run down the
Yeah, let's do that. Thank you, Gernot.
So
Start us off.
So hello, everybody. Thank you for the invite. My name is Gernot Laganda. I work with the World Food Programme. I think one problem we encounter in the conversation about loss and damage is that it is still hard to delineate from other concepts. I think when you speak with IFIs about it, there is still a big overlap with the discussion around adaptation. And then there is also, lately also, an overlap with the discussion around financing. Sorry, do you hear that, Mike? Good? Yeah. Okay, we swap it. Thank you. So adaptation for us is always, you have several years to build systems. And this is not what loss and damage is about. Loss and damage is for some very direct support to affected communities. This is where the second problem comes in. Sometimes here you perceive loss and damage as a transfer of money from one government to another, but loss and damage needs to be really measured at the level at the local level, at the level of individuals and communities. And it cannot be addressing humanitarian needs after people already are in life-threatening situations. They need to receive that money as close to that impact as possible, ideally before, because it is not climate justice when people are standing in bread lines after they have already lost everything. So it needs to be before and in anticipation.
Thank you so much, Gernot, and I forgot to introduce you, indeed, the Director of the Climate and Resilience Service at the World Food Programme. Okay, now over to you, Cynthiana Puskas, who's a climate migration expert at the International Organization for Migration.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's so great to be here with you, and thank you for this great event and a lot of experts on this panel. When it comes to priorities and gaps, I have three keywords for us today. Scale, slow onset, and plan relocation. And I want to dive into this. First of all, the scale. We see that displacement due to climate change, due to disasters, is happening more and more. Every year we see that the numbers are changing. Some of them are increasing, some of them are becoming more intense. We see small islands facing a lot more displacement than before, which is a big part of their population. It's not a big number for us at global level, but at the level of impact, it's huge. So whatever we get into climate finance needs to meet this new scale, the scale that we will see in the future if, as my colleague from WFP said, we are not prepared. If we do not make those investments early on, then we need to face the scale of displacement ahead of us. Second point, slow onset. We still see, at least from the migration side, the displacement side, and we've seen the report UNHCR published this year, we do not know much about slow onset. What are the losses and damages incurred in slow onset settings due to slow onset events, slow onset processes? And it's the same in displacement and migration issues. We still do not know how many people are on the move due to slow onset events, slow onset processes. We're starting to get a bit of an idea in the context of drought. Maybe we know the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center is looking a bit into that. But genuinely, we are not prepared for it. We see that some people move across borders because their crops are not yielding anymore, so they have to find other alternative livelihoods. But we are not yet there in terms of the knowledge. And final key point, plan relocation. Are we ready for the scale of the funding needed to move entire communities, to move entire villages, for people to change livelihoods, become from being fishermen to becoming herders? How are we going to finance that? How are we going to get the local communities ready for that? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cinciana. Okay, moving on now, along to you, Zinta Somers, who's the Climate Science and Practice Lead at OCHA, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and also the Vice Chair of Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Zinta, what would be your top lines?
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. And building on, others have mentioned anticipatory action and preparedness as gaps, the need to scale. So I'll add, I think permanence is a word that is important here. Humanitarian community often, we come in, we act often in 6 to 12 month time frames. OCHA, for example, in 2023, funded the repair of 84,000 water points. And that's great and very important, but it's not necessarily permanent. And what these communities need often are forms of reconstruction that are longer term and permanent. So looking at the fund can fill that gap, and looking at how we build longer term housing, longer term resilient water points, etc. I also think, you've mentioned some of the gaps in slow onset. Obviously, humanitarians don't often cover issues related to cultural loss or ecosystem degradation, and that's certainly an area that the fund can help fill and take action to fund work in that area.
Great, thanks, Zinta. And now, Emmanuel Natale, who's the manager for climate environment at the Uganda Red Cross. What are the key gaps from your point of view?
Coming from the Red Cross, which is based in Uganda, which is one of the LDCs, we are always so much at the forefront of responding to these disasters that we see. And when we talk about loss and damage, if we are to get data about loss and damage, you will find that we have data sets of impacts of these climate-induced disasters. So our top priority is the loss and damage should be able to address DRR at that community level and build community resilience. In addition to anticipatory action, sometimes, and from experience of working with the communities for quite so long in disaster settings, it's too late. So the loss and damage fund should not be like these other existing funds where you actually need funds to prepare you to access the funds. That's too long, and it would not address like the gap. So it needs to address DRR and community resilience. It needs to address the issues of community building, the frameworks, the legal frameworks, and also structures to be able to take action that is quick and rapid.
That's great. Thank you so much. So we can already hear some really key ideas coming out there around making sure that support really is at the local level, that it's more of a focus on being anticipatory, really prepared to take action. The long-term or permanence, as you were saying, Zinta, so more longer-lasting solutions beyond normal humanitarian timeframes, community resilience, scale, slow onset, planned relocation, and also the issues around cultural loss or non-economic loss and damage, as it's being called under the discussions here. So things which don't normally fit sort of traditionally into the humanitarian frameworks, but are clearly very linked. Fantastic start to our discussion. All right. Now, let's think a little bit more together about the existing humanitarian mechanisms and ways of working. And maybe you can all help us here now to also just increase the understanding in this COP space of what that looks like. Something that we've all observed probably as humanitarian actors is that in the discourse, because we're all working often in these silos and our different echo chambers, and the real understanding of the humanitarian system is often quite low. And parties are struggling sometimes to really understand, well, what are you talking about? How does the humanitarian system more concretely help to address the gaps? How can we complement? Where's the coherence, right? That's the real theme coming up now for this high-level dialogue. So I'd like to turn here just to maybe to Zinta and to Gernot again and ask you to explain for everybody what you'd like to highlight in terms of these existing mechanisms and ways of working that can really add.
Sure, maybe I'll go first, and then you can provide some more practical experience. Just to give you an overview, there are many ways that the Loss and Damage Fund can interact with the humanitarian system. At the global level, we have mechanisms to coordinate activities and actions. For example, there's as you mentioned, the Interagency Standing Committee, which is supporting this hub and these discussions here, which works with UN agencies, non-governmental organizations, the Red Cross movement, to coordinate activities, including on climate. We also have at the country level, and that's obviously where we're talking about the need for change on the ground at the community level. We have the HC, so the Humanitarian Coordinator, appointed to different countries, and we have an HC system. And at the country level, there is a lot of activity and coordination between agencies. So, for example, each year we develop a humanitarian response plan and humanitarian needs overview where we identify kind of some of the losses that are occurring, needs in different area. And we also work across something called the cluster system, where different agencies help coordinate activity related to infrastructure, food, water, health. And this occurs both between UN agencies and non-governmental organizations, but also they often work with the government. So they liaise with the government to plan activities and identify needs. So it's certainly, for the Loss and Damage Fund, it'll be very important to engage both at the global level, but at the country level with these existing mechanisms that are already taking action to respond to losses and damages, and to identify, how to then further supplement funding or to plan activities that complement the work that's going on there. But Gernot might want to give specific examples and further insights from the food specific sectors.
Thanks, Zinta.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe in addition to what Zinta just said, give you a few examples of how the humanitarian sector is already trying to improve and probably adjust itself to these new realities of loss and damage. Last year, 2023, was the hottest year ever recorded. It was also an unprecedented year of heat waves, storms, floods, droughts in many parts of the world. And in an unprecedented number of countries, anticipatory cash was dispersed to local communities before they got hit by disasters. This is actually a big deal because the traditional way the humanitarian system works is there is an impact, then we go out and assess the damage, who needs which kinds of support, then we raise money and then we provide the support. There's very little pre-positioned financing in the system, only around 2% of all the aid funding in the world is pre-positioned. So there is a real benefit to getting a cash transfer to a household 3 to 4 days before they get impacted by a flood. And we can do that even in the most difficult, hard to reach, fragile contexts. In Sudan, for example, it is in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Somalia, it is not easy to reach people with the existing development setup. But as humanitarian organizations, we reach deeply into the field where we have local partners, and these local partners then support the humanitarian action. These partners can be empowered, enabled to also support anticipatory action before people get hit. And maybe one additional element that we have learned to do over the past decade, we learned how to work with insurance mechanisms. So because we have such a big funding gap, we have around 40 to 50% funding gap between the humanitarian needs out there and the resources required to provide humanitarian aid, we try to crowd in payouts from insurance mechanisms for events that have return periods that are not every year, but usually 6 to 10 years. So catastrophic events that are rare, but they are now more and more likely. And so these payouts, they come because these are parametric products, they come much earlier than also our traditional humanitarian fundraising, and we can get it out immediately, few weeks and a few months after the event has happened. So in combination, this is a very powerful setup where you have financial protection for the most vulnerable that is a little bit better than what we have been doing over the past few decades.
Great. So indeed, so as well as the more traditional, if you will, the humanitarian response, that emergency response role, with that, all kinds of mechanisms, learning that's in place. Also, much more the sector is moving, thinking much harder and changing some of the ways of working in terms of being more anticipatory, not in terms of just action, but also the funding points and using more innovative ways of doing that, like insurance. Thank you, Gernot and Zinta. That's great. So indeed, there's so much out there in this humanitarian landscape of action already. So I'd like to turn now actually to Emmanuel and to Cynthiana again. And here, the question I'd like you to focus on is what opportunities actually exist already, therefore, to really make sure that that exchange of national and local knowledge and experience, especially from those highly vulnerable situations, humanitarian crises, including fragile and conflict-affected contexts, how that national and local knowledge can actually be leveraged, exchanged to guide and strengthen the loss and damage responses. Emmanuel?
Yes, I will go first. And I want to borrow the experiences from Uganda specifically, where we have a coordination structure, like the arrangement of the Red Cross, where we are part of the national frameworks for disaster management in the country as part of the policy. We are at the district level, we have the district disaster management committees, and we are at the community level as part of the community structures. So that's been instrumental. It paves way for both top-down approach and also down to top. So we see these structures already existing. We are able to get feedback and information that shapes programming from both the communities that we are part of and also the other way around from the national level. For largely anticipatory action, which is also one of the approach that has, I think, gotten so many humanitarian actors now to think about coordination more seriously. We see there are platforms like national level dialogue platforms where they are discussing and sharing different things which are happening in Uganda, which and many countries, which also cascade to regional and global levels. And we see these platforms over the years where they have been. I think last this year, there was another global dialogue platform where very many humanitarian actors were in the same space. And this was coming from national level. There are national events where different actors come to the same place. And I think the loss and damage should take these similar approaches. So in some of these conversations where we are discussing anticipatory action, in some of these regional platforms of disaster risk management and reduction, loss and damage should also be one of on the agenda, on top of the agenda, because you cannot delineate loss and damage from disasters when we are talking about humanitarian response. If we are to get data on loss and damage, I emphasize, from the humanitarian point of view, we shall have data on climate-induced losses. These are properties destroyed, these are livelihoods destroyed. Some we can't quantify, like the loss of lives that we are always dealing with in figures. So these platforms are existing, they just have to be strengthened, and we also can see what we can learn from them largely. Yeah.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Cynthiana.
Thank you so much for that example. I think it builds very good into what I would like to say. And there's 3 levels in what I think answers your question. First, it would be very important to look at the engagement and participation of the affected communities. And here at COP, IOM and UNHCR had the privilege to accompany representatives of refugees, of migrants, of displaced persons to come here and share their voice. And that kind of engagement and that kind of participation, it's great here in COP, but it has to continue exactly in this kind of coordination mechanism that Emmanuel was describing as well. We need to work hand in hand with the people that are affected, because most likely they have the solution. They need the means of implementation, what they're discussing in the negotiation rooms. So that's one level, the engagement and the participation. And there's multiple ways to do that meaningfully and actively. And we know that IFRC, for example, is doing that very well, working hand in hand with the communities. In IOM, we're doing that. We're always there with local partners, as is WFP as well. So let's continue that. And as another level that perhaps came very strongly across during the COVID pandemic and the response that all of our organizations has was the need to work with local authorities, with cities, with town halls. It might not be the first engagement as humanitarian actors. We usually go at the disaster response national entities, but we saw that they can have a crucial and a critical role in responding to some of these emergencies. And COVID was a very good example, because there was no way to travel outside of the cities, so they had to be responsible for the migrants in their cities, for the refugees in their cities, for example. And it's the same in loss and damage response, I believe. And I was discussing actually with a representative of an organization trying to work with the Texas local government, and was talking about migration and climate change and how sensitive that is for them now. But they're trying to change their local policies to still ensure that migrants and refugees that are arriving in their cities, that the effects of climate change that other people are feeling can be responded to, even if it doesn't match the federal law or it doesn't match the national law. And then the third level, I think it's opportunities like this, global forums, COPs. This is an opportunity to promote that exchange, that engagement with national and local authorities. We know that there's an urban pavilion, we know that there's a migration pavilion, there's the resilience pavilion. These are the spaces where we can promote that engagement even further. We have the global platform on DRR coming up next year. Let's continue those engagements as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthiana. Nimo, can I invite you maybe also as coming from the NGO, the Somalia NGO Consortium, your more NGO and more national experience and thoughts on this?
Great, thank you very much. I think it's great listening to the panelists and on the various different ways that we can learn from humanitarian action on the Loss and Damage Fund, particularly in this fragile context where you've got many vulnerabilities that are hitting the communities. I will certainly say I think we definitely need to on this we have an opportunity to flip the script and start with the communities and start with those who are better placed, who are the front lines, the grassroots organizations, the national and local NGOs, to think through exactly what these communities need. So I think it's really important that that agency is given to the community, and that their participation and engagement is not at the end tail of the fund and infrastructure, but at the beginning of it. And it's really we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot to learn from in terms of what the needs are. Food systems are particularly one important area. I think the example I referred to of the loss of that little girl as an example, Obah, is one story where actually it's hunger and it's not having access to livelihoods is having the most damage and the most loss. So, for example, we as an NGO consortia, we have many organizations who are grassroots, women-led, who are minority rights organizations. We have a diverse communities that we can actually draw from when delivering and developing this infrastructure on loss and damage. And like I said, I think it's absolutely we need to take this opportunity for this new funding to flip that script and get the communities to lead and have the agency to determine their own futures and what they need. And I totally agree in investing in that anticipatory action and ensuring that we're investing and ensuring communities have the ability to withstand shocks that we know for sure are going to come time and time again. Thank you.
Great. So a whole bunch of really important ideas there. Indeed, that multitude of platforms, those dialogues. So we're talking about another dialogue, right? In April, this high-level dialogue. But how can that dialogue be informed by all these other dialogues which are very well established, right? And already really in-depth exploring many of the issues which will be very relevant here. Thanks for highlighting that, Emmanuel. Very importantly, I think, coming across many of you around the voices of the affected coming through, that participation point, that local agency, the flip the script. I've got that one. That's a great buzz line there. Thank you, Nemo. And indeed, in this high-level dialogue itself, where are those voices going to be? Where is their participation going to be? I think that's a question many of us might be asking at the moment as well. Okay, now we're going to be coming over to you guys again for questions, any questions and comments in a moment. But before we do that, I'm going to just do another quick fire round through all of you. I want to hear what your top recommendations. So really action-oriented. What can be done? Not just the commitments now, but what can be actually done in terms of recommendations to get that support to ground, make sure that loss and damage is really being responded to. Shall we start from this end this time, Emmanuel?
Yes, I'm happy to support very clear recommendations. I think the very first one, which is also reflecting from what she said, flipping the coin, should be not to structure this fund like how the rest of the climate funds have been structured, where you structure a fund and then you realize that you actually need another fund to help the communities access the fund, and then you start discussing on the fund is not reaching the communities. It's because you're designing it from here and then you're thinking that, okay, how should it reach the community? And then you design another fund, readiness fund, the fund to help you access the fund. So that should not be the same cycle that we follow for loss and damage fund. So for this upcoming dialogue for loss and damage, it should really be clear from the start when they're designing like the frameworks and the instrument. It should be a fund that is designed with the priorities of the communities and the different settings, the different vulnerabilities and the different capacities. Not to design it first and then we'll be like, oh, maybe we need funding to train these people on how to write a proposal to access the fund. Maybe we need this other fund to help people to access this fund. So that has to be really, really very clear. And it should be the implementation frameworks. The implementation frameworks should really be very clear and affordable by the different countries and communities.
Great, thank you. Zinta?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of learning that needs to take place. We often work in silos, the humanitarian community, the climate community, the development community, and there are a lot of existing mechanisms, a lot of knowledge at the local level, internationally, that we need to share so that we don't reinvent the wheel. And the fear is that we have a board that will go and design a fund that doesn't recognize or build on the lessons that exist both on the ground and at the local level or in the humanitarian community. And so I guess if I had a recommendation and lots of extra funding, then I would ask that board to have a education in the humanitarian system and to learn more about what we're doing and what's taking place on the ground, and then also recognizing that many of the board members themselves come from vulnerable communities, but have a trip around the world and let's go and speak to communities and engage them in the process of the design and learn from each other. So learning and continued sharing through mechanisms such as this or others, I think, are really critical.
Thanks, Zinta. Cynthiana.
Thank you. I would like to say that having been listening to the negotiations in the fund, in the transitional committee here at COPS and in Bonn, I have the impression there's a myth in these rooms that direct access to communities is impossible. It's very hard. We don't know, I was talking to a colleague and it's like, Cynthiana, what do you want us to do, to make an ATM in every village? It's like, it's not that. There's this myth that we need to dissipate. Direct access to communities is very much possible, and WFP was talking about cash-based interventions. We know they work. We know we're doing it. We're disbursing millions every year in cash flows to communities directly before disasters, after disasters, to build resilience, to respond to communities, to respond to disaster. So direct access, and not only to communities, there is a request for national budget transfers, right? Those things, they're all being described as very high financial risk. Who is going to take the risk for such transfer? Who's going to, assume everything that might go wrong in those things? And if I understand correctly, and if I read the science right and the data right, there's not that much risk. It seems to work actually quite well when the money goes ahead, as you were describing earlier, when the money goes to the right people. They use it quite well, and they know what to do with it. So I would like to perhaps leave that message with us, and concretely how we can dissipate that myth in the negotiation room is if we invite those people to come in the room. The board is at the moment working without an observer policy. It's been working for a full year without knowing how observers can participate in the negotiations. So they're defining a fund, they're defining how to operationalize a fund without the affected people being able to contribute. So let's make sure that observer policy, that affected community policies, it's established and people can contribute. And they have the mechanism in the decision. They have these stakeholder consultations that they want to do. Let's make that happen. Thanks.
Thanks, Cynthiana.
Yeah, these were some great points. And actually, when you look back into 2023, we're not transferring millions, we're transferring billions in cash. 2 to 3 billion in cash in every year in WFP alone. So the systems are there, as you say. So if for that dialogue, I think one aspect that will need to be there in some shape or form, every country will need to define a baseline on loss and damage in some way, right? And I think they can also draw on the experience on the humanitarian side, how many people have been affected by which kind of disasters. Couple this maybe with these attribution studies that are already out there. But everybody needs to know when they're working in a government and they engage in this board on loss and damage, what is our situation? What loss and damage are we talking about? What hits us and what hits the communities especially hard? And I think then they also need to delineate a loss and damage plan, how to localize the support. It cannot be like in the GCF, the money goes through national governments and then it takes 3 years to maybe make its way down to the local level. So there a localization plan for loss and damage where really then we're talking climate justice without any, spending the money on consultants or any other overheads. It should go very directly. So the baseline, the plan, and I think there is also the Santiago network that is now being established, where governments can draw on technical expertise to help assess all these things, including from the entities that are around the table here and that have some of the data related to food insecurity, related to water sanitation, related to migration, that can be very relevant in that dialogue.
Thank you. Last but not least, Nima.
Great, thank you very much. I concur with a lot of the message that the panelists have already shared. I think for me, I would focus on the fund being fair and adequate. It needs to be timely. Definitely, time is of the essence for a lot of people. It's their livelihoods, it's their lives, and the accessibility to communities. We have to underscore that it has to be underlined. There's no way you can do anything without the involvement of the communities in a meaningful way. And many of these countries that we're talking about are vulnerable, are already affected by other fragility. So it's really important that we are focusing where it may be hardest to do, but it's the most important to invest in. And then ensuring that we invest in those countries with lower adaptive capacities as well. We also need to make sure that we are ahead of disasters and not while disasters are there. This is the job of the humanity. So we don't need to replicate that. And I think one point you've raised about the risk, that risk has to be shared. I mean, whose risk are we talking about? Is the stakeholder, it's the system, and we need to be protecting the communities. And we usually, the risk is transferred and not shared. So that risk really needs to be shared, and it has to be a collective, it has to be the collective investment, all of us, to ensure that we are reaching those communities who need us the best. Thank you.
Great. I think also within that, some really concrete recommendations for those key actors, those board members in the loss and damage architecture, amongst others, to be doing more themselves. I'm hearing a lot about that. Yeah, recognizing that it is possible. We know from the humanitarian experience those communities can be reached, including with funds, right? No more excuses, right? The experience is out there, something can be done here. That this observer policy point about the fund, absolutely very important. If we're going to make sure that participation, that voice comes through, that agency is given that space, where's that observer policy for the fund, but I would say also for this high-level dialogue on the funding arrangements, right? Where, if it's not the policy, it's leaving it too much to chance that somebody will remember to ensure that there is a really concrete and meaningful space for people on the front lines, communities, indigenous peoples, displaced persons, migrants in vulnerable situations, all of the above, right? That they do have a space to be heard, to really meaningfully participate. Anticipatory action, that's been coming throughout all of this discussion. There's a lot of points there. But let me stop and turn to all of you and see if you'd like to add anything yourselves or ask some questions to our esteemed panelists here. Start with the gentleman directly in front of me here. Thank you. If you could introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. My name is Farah Osman from Somalia, Plan International. Just want to follow up on the issue of the loss and damage. I can give you an example. In 2022, someone who had 370 cattle lost them within a month and became an IDP in Kismayo with his kids. The person is still an IDP. We are talking about loss and damage. So is there accountability in it? That's one. Number two, during the floods in the same year, late 2022, 2023, a rural a pastoralist with 50 camel lost them all in one go when they were stuck in mud. And then he went out with his kids, leaving the camel there, became an IDP in Doble. Is there accountability in it? A farmer in Kismayo lost his farming land in Gogbain, Lower Juba. I asked him, why are you in IDP? Why did you go back to the farm? He said, I lost everything. I lost my equipment, I lost my house, I lost my camp. I came with my kids here. So we're not talking about loss and damage. I think we need to call a spade and talk about the reality on the ground. And then the other point I would like to stress is the importance of planning with them, not planning for them. because the needs are different, the context is different. So it's important that we plan with them, we sit with them, we respond to their priority needs and build on what they can do. So let's not think for them, but let's support what they think works for them and what they think they will own and take initiative in improving their life. Thank you.
I'll take another couple of responses, and this gentleman here, and there's a lady there, white. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm from Somalia. I work for the government of Somalia. I conquer the discussions. For the last 6 months, I work with rural communities. I realized that we come to COP, we come to international platforms, we talk about loss and damage, we talk about new quantifiable objective for climate finance. But when it comes to these people, the gap between COP29 in Baku and them, like the fund goes to sometimes third party, then goes to the federal government of Somalia, where the federal ministers fight. He says it goes to agriculture or goes to livelihood, then it goes down to the state, then goes down to the municipality. Then I work with two communities. Together we are about 180 households. They know nothing about bankable project. They know nothing about concept notes. They know nothing about all this stuff. Then at the end of the day, how are we going to save those lives while we are here at these negotiations? I think it's time for us to directly deal with those communities. They don't care whether it goes through through me, the government, or through the aim of the NGO. They don't care. At the end of the day, they have to have something on their table. Coming to loss and damage, when it comes to economic loss, we have a lot of financial and economic models using econometric data. But in a study we did this year using the International Disaster Database, in Somalia, the variables you have, when you see the loss, the economic loss, as what causing, if you calculate the correlation between the human loss, the human lives lost to the loss, actually the loss is affected significantly by the number of affected people rather than the number of death or the number of this stuff. Then it comes to the question we discussed about the non-economic loss and damage. How are we going to quantify? Well, because it's important. People are affected more by the non-economic loss and damage than the economic loss and damage. I think that discussion also is very important. Thank you very much. And I hope we continue the discussions.
Thank you. I'm going to keep going with another couple, I think, because I don't see so many questions, a lot of comments. Yes, the lady in white there, and then the gentleman next to her.
Thank you. Thanks very much for this excellent discussion. My name is Isabel Pelli. I'm with Give Directly, which is an organization that specializes in delivering direct, unconditional cash transfers, including to people on the front line of climate change. And I just wanted to share some reflections, hopefully bringing together some different thoughts from the panelists. So, can you hear me? Sorry. Direct cash transfers are possible, as you've shared, but in addition to them being possible as part of anticipatory action or humanitarian assistance, what we've been doing is piloting what that looks like as a form of loss and damage in Malawi in response to Cyclone Freddy. And I think we have some key takeaways that I want to share. So firstly is really for it to have the transformational impact we need. I'm not saying that it's going to necessarily recover 370 heads of cattle, but something that's different to regular social assistance or regular humanitarian payments. The amounts need to be sufficient to allow, to cover basic needs, reconstruction, recovery, and that's what we've learned from our program. Actually, we provided $750 per household, and frankly, it wasn't enough. And if we want to actually do something different, it needs to be much more than that. That's what we've learned through this experience. But rather than just have this case study, what we've done is we've produced some principles on what effective loss and damage programming looks like as cash transfers, and we've just published them with the Loss and Damage Collaboration. And so what I'd like to hear from you all, and thinking about how do we influence the board strategically, is basically I'd love to build alliances around these principles. I'd be really happy to share them with the panel and hear from you all who are very entwined with these processes, how we can make that case together. Thanks.
How can we make that case together? Noted as a question to come back to you all on. Gentleman beside you.
Okay. Also from Give Directly, I just wanted to underscore the observation and reflection to say people on the ground, given our experience in Malawi, do not care where this money comes from. They do not care whether we feel that it's for agriculture or health. They have their own priorities in terms of how they feel they need to recover from loss and damage, and cash is uniquely positioned to be able to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll also take another this lady over here, and then this gentleman with the check shirt just here.
If you want to stand up.
Thank you so much. I'm Lillian from Concern Worldwide Kenya. So, first of all, I want to appreciate what I've had. I've had the gentleman from WFP talk about localizing the support to fit the local context, and I totally agree with that. Working in a region where we are constantly affected by floods, followed by severe droughts, we've come up with policies. And in our policies, it says that 50% goes towards resilience building. But my question mostly is, how do we work to mitigate these effects in the long run? How do we make the local communities to adapt? What are these long-lasting solutions in terms of resilience, building resilience of the communities so that in the events of floods and droughts, they are not affected, and despite all that, their life can continue? Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman in the check shirt just here. Is there a mic?
Hi, thank you very much for the panel. It's nice to see some familiar faces. My name is Will. I'm a policy journalist at the New Humanitarian. I have a couple of questions I'd be interested in getting panelists' sort of reflections on. The real kind of theme that's coming through for me on this point is that like anticipatory action and sort of related preemptive financing kind of ideas are the main thrust of what the humanitarian agencies sort of want the fund to kind of do. Have I kind of read that right? Is there any ideas about for what happens after events where humanitarians are kind of sort of already very well set up, and indeed where there is a lot more kind of money flowing as it is, anticipatory cash is very, very low. Also about the fund working in places affected by violence. A lot of the other big discussions here at COP are about getting more climate finance into places affected by conflicts and fragility. I know we've got some Somalian representation here. I think like the Somalian government is kind of almost unique and very forward-leaning on this agenda. Humanitarians often work in places affected by violence where the government is not as kind of willing to listen. Do humanitarians have kind of ideas about dispersing funds in these sorts of contexts and doing things in a kind of a conflict-sensitive way? Just interesting reflections there.
Okay, I'm going to take just one more now, and then we'll come back to all of you.
Hi, I'm Ahmed from the Maldives, and I would like to put the spotlight on the SIDS countries as well, and actually amplify what the panelists from IOM mentioned about the slow onset disasters, especially sea level rise. And talking about loss and damage, where do we draw the baseline when we're talking about the mere existence of a country, which we already see the movement from our sister island nations in the Pacific. So we're talking about not just economic loss, but the mere existence of a whole country. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So there's a whole bunch of ideas there and some very concrete questions. We haven't got so much time, but I think it's already signaling there's a lot more conversation on this topic that needs to take place and follow on. And that is already happening as well, also in different places. But I'll just invite any of you who'd like to respond to anything there that just, spiked you into wanting to say something before we close.
I'll maybe answer two of the questions just about anticipatory action, because OCHA, through the Central Emergency Response Fund, actually funds 50% of the world's anticipatory action. So we're one of the big player here. And, I think this year we've given over 100 million to, I believe it's 17 countries for anticipatory action. That's clearly not sufficient. So I don't think what we're asking is for the fund to to take our place, but certainly to help scale it, because that's not enough. It's not reaching enough people. I mean, the comment from Give Directly, we do fund cash transfers, but they're obviously, they need to be larger. They're often not sufficient to meet all the needs. So I think what the fund can look at is how do we work with governments, be it at the national or local level, to scale, for example, shock responsive social safety nets, so that they are anticipatory and that they reach the full range of vulnerable communities in each country. So certainly helping scale anticipatory action, but not, I don't think they can reinvent what we're doing. The design of triggers is very complicated. We'd have to work very closely with them. But there's definitely a gap to be filled there. And in terms of your comments and your lessons from your experience in Malawi, I'll just maybe point to some of the organizers of this session who are sitting at the front. With the IASC, we are actually working as a humanitarian community, to develop messaging for the Loss and Damage Board, and certainly that you can engage and help share that. And I think this hub next week will become the humanitarian hub, and one of the questions that will be posed to everybody is, what if we work together collectively, to help build a world in which nobody suffers from disasters. And so I think that notion of collective action, let's move from this and work together as the collective humanitarian community to affect that change.
Thanks, Inter. Anyone else? Good.
So maybe just adding to our colleague from Malawi, I completely agree, right? We should not sequester into a community of loss and damage professionals without really seeing the big picture, which means that there is a mitigation agenda that's at the root cause of all the problems that we're now speaking about. There is an adaptation agenda that basically needs to deal with the system strengthening in these countries, so that, for example, a national Met service can provide the early warning systems that can then be coupled with cash transfers. There is the conversation about disaster risk reduction and loss and damage that we are having right now, but let's please also engage in the other ones, because we will not be able to stem the tide of climate change with, absorbing loss and damage with any amount of cash. If you have read the adaptation gap report alone, we are really at the sharp end of the issue, trying to catch up, but with very insufficient means. So my plea would be, let's make sure we basically connect with mitigation, adaptation, disaster risk reduction, loss and damage, disaster response, everything coherently. The last one I want to say, there is probably cash is very, very interesting because it is not telling people what to do. People use the cash in a way that they need to protect their animals, their livestock, their homestead, evacuate people, buy medicine before the markets are closed for people who have conditions, have nutritional products for their children in the house, before then everything is cut off. So cash is really very versatile, and it stimulates the local economy. So it's, I think, a really very central piece to the loss and damage conversation. And because you need to get the cash to people, it can strengthen a social protection system that is in some countries already there, but in others it's only nascent. And then basically, as we are trying to get the cash to people, there can be a conversation also on how that social protection system needs to be structured.
Thanks, Gernot. Anyone else? Keeping it very, very short, please, Emmanuel. Pressed for time.
Yes, we're running out of time. I resonate with my colleague from Somalia about you can't quantify all the damages. At least for cattle, at least you can count and send 97 cows, but for the lives. The other year alone in Uganda, we lost more than 12 people because of these climate-induced disasters. So we just need to have the same voice for sufficient fund, and also that is designed to reach the communities.
Thanks, Emmanuel. If I may just add as well, the point around a baseline, that needing that data, that baseline, just to flag that also for those of you following the Warsaw International Mechanism review here that's ongoing here at the COP, that's one of the points that's coming up, a request from some of the parties for an annual loss and damage report, like there is already an annual adaptation report, for example. Just thought I'd flag that. Tiziana.
Thank you, and thank you so much for bringing up the issue of small island states and small island developing states as well. It's a really good point how they will be served. We know under the fund they are supposed to have, together with the LDCs, a minimum percentage allocation. What will that mean? How will that be translated into actual programming at national level? It will be very interesting to see. And what will be that percentage? and what will it go to? And at the beginning, I was talking about planned relocation, and from our side, that's probably going to be one of the biggest challenges of small island states when it comes to their populations. And we heard the Pacific Islands Forum Secretary General yesterday in an event talking exactly about this. We do not want to move, but we are already planning to move on higher ground, and that is extremely expensive. There's a lot of money involved in that, and the fund has a responsibility to match those needs. And to go back to our colleague from the humanitarian news, I don't think we're asking for preemptive finance as part of the loss and damage fund. We are asking as preemptive finance as part of the whole package of climate finance. We have the Green Climate Fund, we have the Adaptation Fund, we have the Global Environmental Facility, and now the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. Some of that has to go to to anticipatory action, to emergency preparedness, to minimum preparedness plans, to contingency planning, of course. But there is something quite specific to this fund, that there is a gap that the other funds do not cover yet, and that's the part of the response of the loss and damage that is quite niche in that. Thank you. And on your last question, I do want to, I know, Michelle, you're the moderator, but I think you have a very good insight on how climate finance should go into conflict areas. So I don't know if you want to say now or afterwards, but I do want to point out that UNHCR is really looking a lot into that and how we can make that better. Thank you.
Nemo.
Yeah, maybe just quickly to say, and just to bring us back to the community aspect, for communities, it doesn't matter where the fund comes from. It needs to get that fast. It needs to be adequate. It needs to be timely. As we're speaking, there are people who are losing either their livelihoods or their lives. So I just really want to give the urgency that this issue desires and it requires. For us, it's conversation. For people, it's a matter of life and death.
Indeed, and I am from the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. I forgot to introduce myself to you all. But also on that point, actually yesterday we launched a new network that we're calling Refugees for Climate Action, which is about recognizing the capacities and the energy, the local leadership happening, being implemented by refugee-led organizations, RLOs as we call them. So there's, again, so many experiences here on the stage, amongst all of you. Let's keep the conversation going. The summary from this event will be written up and shared, so watch out for that for those of you who want to report on it. And you've seen our contacts here. Please reach out to us after the event if you want to keep discussing. Thank you all very much for coming. Wishing you a good day.